For months now, someone has been on the attack, recruiting and educating my oldest foes in new and deadly ways. That sort of operation requires time and money, and as Bruce Wayne should know, there are only a handful of people who have enough of both. As a detective, my task was to narrow that list down to one suspect. Today on the Comic Book Report, Batman Hush. Stick around and check it out. Greetings from Gotham, everyone. My name is Dominic, and you're watching The Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today, I'll tell you right from the jump, we are looking at one of my all-time favorite comic books. Of course, I'm talking about Jeph Loeb and Jim Lee's Batman Hush. I cannot believe it's been 20 years since this comic started dropping in single issues. And I thought a 20-year anniversary was a good enough excuse to go ahead and finally give this one a review. But first, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Jeph Loeb and penciled by Jim Lee. The issues in this volume were first published by DC Comics beginning in 2002. The volume itself collects Batman issues 608 to 619 and includes a 6-page segment from Wizard issue 0. And finally, this trade paperback collection comes in at 320 pages. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and issue a brief spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the entirety of this collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at the collection proper. This is my trade paperback collection of Batman Hush. I believe there are newer trade paperbacks that might have different covers that you can find in stores or online, of course. But this is my trade paperback cover. I think this came out maybe over a decade ago now, which is just wild to me. But as you can see from the cover art, this is already showcasing some of Jim Lee's just absolutely stunning work that you see in the contents of this book. The trade paperback is a standard size, and it has glossy print paper stock. Now, as we go ahead and transition from the exterior look to the interior of the volume itself, I just wanted to provide a little bit more context on Batman Hush, especially for prospective readers out there that have maybe never given Hush a try. You can find this book in several different trade paperbacks. There's one trade paperback that is actually a 2-volume edition that's out there. There's also various hardcovers. There's some noir editions, which are like kind of black and white, like sketchwork version of this. Some anniversary collections, and of course an absolute edition. You can also find it on digital, single issues, things like that. But for those that don't know, this does take place within the actual Batman title run, but for those maybe who aren't reading kind of a sequential Batman comic run through, you can absolutely read this as its own standalone work, and I think that that's how I approached it personally. I knew, the big points of Batman's history, and I was able to pick this up, dive right in, and just have one heck of a ride. I think that first and foremost, I think Batman Hush is absolutely accessible to newer Batman readers. That being said, I think if you've read Death in the Family and just have a functional understanding of some of Batman's just biggest villains and cast of characters, that will only enrich your read-through of this book, but they're by no means prerequisite reading. It'll fill you in on what you need to enjoy this book. But like I said, if you've read some of those stories, if you're familiar with those characters, and you have a better understanding of some of the folks you'll find in a Batman work, it'll just enrich your experience of Batman Hush. But again, I think that you can pull this off the shelves and just enjoy it with really no other requirements needed. As far as the plotline for Batman Hush, like Jeph Loeb's other work with Batman that included The Long Halloween and Dark Victory, Hush is also a kind of detective story. It's a whodunit mystery that spans certainly all of Gotham, along with some other locations around the globe. And this is something that I believe is absolutely deftly handled by Jeph Loeb. Like I said, he's worked on Long Halloween and its sequel Dark Victory, both of which I reviewed on the channel, and you can tell that he understands the kind of pacing and plotting that's required for this kind of detective mystery story, where he still wants to provide a good look at a lot of Batman's villains. And I think there's a way that we were able to see so many villains showcased in this without it feeling too gimmicky or trivial. I feel like every villain played their part in the grand narrative and the whole mastermind plan that we see throughout Hush. much. I know the first time I read it, it really kept me on my toes, and rereading it over and over again, I still find something new every time I read that I just enjoy, or pops out of the pages, or I just see in a new way. And of course, this story was absolutely elevated by the unbelievable work by Jim Lee as he penciled and did the illustrations on this volume. For my money, I love Jim Lee. He's probably my favorite comic book artist, and I know that I'm not the only one with that opinion. But I don't know if this is a hot take either, but this is actually my favorite work I've ever seen Jim Lee do. And as my favorite comic book artist, that actually is me saying this is the most beautiful comic book art I have read personally. From my own opinion, I have not seen something top this for me. I think Batman has never looked better, Gotham has never looked better, and I just loved every page. Maybe one day I'll even upgrade to an absolute edition, just to showcase the exceptional art I see on each and every page. As far as the story itself goes, essentially it picks up with Batman hunting down Killer Croc, who has kidnapped and held a child at ransom, but he notices that Killer Croc is even more feral and monstrous and reptilian looking than normal. His brain is even more muddled, and something's just off. This is not his usual MO. He's a lot more visceral and violent, and he doesn't understand why he's really doing these things. Killer Croc eventually leads to Catwoman, Catwoman leads to Poison Ivy, Poison Ivy leads to, and so on and so on and so on. Jeph Loeb really handles this in such an expert way where, again, I felt that pass-off between villains and new leads on this investigative case on who's behind all this in a way that didn't feel too cheesy to me. I feel like we got to see so many characters that all played their roles without being too gimmicky, or I felt like everything added up, which is a sensation I always love in a good mystery. While this is happening, early in the book, Batman is kind of, flying through the city with his grappling hook gun, and it gets cut, and he falls and cracks his skull open. He almost dies. The kind of anti-hero Huntress actually saves him, gets him in the Batmobile, and gets him home. And so Bruce is on death's door from this horrible head injury, and as he's kind of losing consciousness, he says to contact Dr. Thomas Elliot, which it turns out, as we find out in this volume, that Thomas Elliot was a childhood friend of Bruce Wayne's who also had lost his dad when they were children. It sounds like actually he died on Bruce's father's operating table, and that kind of dissolved their friendship. But he went on to be kind of the world's premier neurosurgeons, and he was able to kind of help Bruce recover and get better. But throughout this whole book, there's this sense that Batman's not at 100% after sustaining this head injury, and his thoughts are really clouded as he kind of contemplates having this childhood acquaintance back in his life in an interesting way. On top of that, his kind of weird relationship with Catwoman has kind of reached a fever pitch of, wow, will they, won't they, are they getting together? For some time, Bruce Wayne has known that Catwoman is Selina Kyle, but Selina Kyle hasn't definitively known about Bruce Wayne's identity as the Batman. And in this story arc, we have him kind of falling for Catwoman deeper, until ultimately he ends up confiding his secret identity in her, and Catwoman becomes his ally, along with Nightwing and Oracle and Robin and all these characters throughout this book. I think for me, this is really something that kick-started the Batman-Catwoman romance. I see this further picked up in Hearts of Hush, that's like kind of a follow-up collection I've enjoyed as well, and certainly in the Tom King's run, which I think absolutely kicked the Batman-Catwoman relationship into high gear. But the kind of romantic softy in me, I really loved that. I loved the romance arc there in this book. I think that there's something tragic and beautiful about their relationship, and to see it explored really for the first time through this lens, I think it's just so powerful today. I'm sure it was 20 years ago as well. As far as the rest of the plot goes, I'll try to leave some up to your own reading of it, but, the thread keeps on getting more and more interesting. We keep finding more and more villains. Joker pops in. There's stuff with the Riddler, Two-Face, Scarecrow. Like I said, it's kind of a greatest hits reel. There's even more than I'm even naming, but again, I'll leave something for, you to find out if you're reading it for the first time. But again, it all culminates in a very satisfying way. There's even some kind of false leads that eventually end up dissolving, and Batman has to regroup and kind of rethink how he's doing the work here. And again, the way that Jeph Loeb blends the past with, his relationship with Thomas Elliot, and even his relationship with Catwoman, and even with his Robins, and all of these dynamics, while kind of juxtaposing that with all this crazy, fast-paced action and detective work going on in the present. I just think it's pretty sublime. There's not a lot of books that I've seen balance flashbacks and present-day moments as well as this book seems to. I like as well that Jeph Loeb, and well, this might be more of a Jim Lee touch, they have a lot of the flashbacks portrayed with this kind of more watercolor looking, kind of sparse, not quite black and white, but muted color scheme watercolor paintings. And I think that's a great way to differentiate the timeline and some of the flashback sequences, and it adds a kind of dreaminess and nostalgia to those flashbacks. And again, I just think it's an exceptional artistic touch that really served the whole theme and story of Batman Hush. One thing I will say, if you want to pick this up because you enjoyed The Long Halloween, which was also written by Jeph Loeb, I think I'll just want to say this doesn't feel as noir or gritty real as Long Halloween might. I think that this is a little more high-flying adventure comic booky Batman. I think that Long Halloween felt a lot more noir crime detective. Both are really great, and there's certainly crime detection involved in Batman Hush, but you lose some of the grittiness. This is also a much more seasoned Batman, a Batman that has his Bat family and a huge cast of characters, versus Long Halloween is thought to have taken place very early in the crime fighter's career, within the first couple years of him being Batman. Long Halloween, he doesn't even have Dick Grayson Robin yet. At this point in Batman Hush, he already had Dick Grayson, he's had Jason Todd, and he's on Tim Drake Robin. There's a lot of mileage, a lot of history that's happened to this Batman, and it's a different kind of story. I think also the art style is so different from Tim Sale's style to Jim Lee's. Again, everyone has their own opinions. They're both masters at the craft. But Batman Hush certainly has a lot to offer. But I think that if someone's coming in trying to compare them, or if you liked Long Halloween and you just want to assume you're going to love Batman Hush, I really can't speak to that. I can only try to underscore some of the differences you might encounter. But I still think that this is absolutely accessible and a fun detective story to go ahead and pick up reading. For longer-time Batman fans, I think for me, one of the things that stick out about Batman Hush specifically is not the introduction of a potentially new villain or the way it spans a bunch of his rogues gallery. For me, it's really the introduction of that romance between Catwoman and Batman. I'm sure there's inklings of that in stories before this, her being such a huge part of his history. But I had never seen that relationship at center stage, under the spotlight and developing in the way it does within the pages of Batman Hush, before Batman Hush. And I really loved that. I think that if not a softer side of Bruce Wayne, certainly a Bruce Wayne and Batman that was deeply affected by this romantic relationship. And I've read a lot of books where he's had girlfriends or, women that have he's cared for in different ways, but they almost felt interchangeable or dime a dozen or inconsequential in a lot of ways. Versus Catwoman is such a dynamic force that's been such a persistent part of his mythos, being around almost since the beginning of the Batman or Detective Comics books. So seeing a character like that, who herself has such a rich backstory, character profile, dynamic, to see her and Batman together, you really got to see kind of a power couple, and you got to see what kind of chaotic chemistry sort of worked in their relationship. I think that this, like I said, is further explored in other Batman runs and arcs. Like I said, if you like this, I think Heart of Hush is a great next step for this book. I'd recommend that for further reading if you enjoyed Batman Hush. And certainly the Tom King run. I think, a lot of people have polarizing thoughts about that Batman run, but I think one of the things I loved was the relationship between Batman and Catwoman. I think that was so fleshed out there, and it felt true to those characters, at least in my mind, and I think that the grounding and the foundation for a lot of what Tom King built up with them, you could see here in the roots at Batman Hush. And with that, I'm already at the end of the collection, and I feel like I could talk for hours about Batman Hush, so this might be one I explore in different ways in the future on this channel. But for right now, I think it's time we go ahead and give this collection a grade. It should be no surprise, with my favorite art in the entire industry that I've read thus far, coupled with a fantastic detective story that showcases everything I love about Batman, between its hero, its cast of colorful supporting characters, and the notorious villains. I am happy to say that the Comic Book Report has to give Batman Hush an A. This is definitely a must-read for me, guys. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it for Batman fans, DC comic fans, and even comic fans alike. Even if Batman is not your typical pickup, I think that there is more than enough to love in this collection for just about everyone. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. It was such a pleasure to review this for you all today. Please check out some of my other videos and have a good one.